Hey everybody, for those of you who could not attend my little chat or babbling, rambling affair the other day in the Mind class, this is a recording of essentially what I said without some of the bad jokes and pointless stories, to get you thinking about not just the ethnography project that you have, but about how we can read a variety of texts through the lens of ethnography. So let's take a look and see what we got. We'll start with a definition, and I don't need to read the slide for you because it's right here, but I want you to begin to think about ethnography as the study of a group of people and the intensive observation about not just the obvious things, but the things that are a little bit below the surface. And often we'll use what we see at the surface level to begin to try and interpret things about the group. We'll analyze the obvious to take that and consider what that tells us about beliefs or a moral code or of values that tie a particular group of people together. Now, if you look at this definition of culture, I think what you'll begin to discover is that we are all members of or participants in different types of cultures, that we might be part of a religious community that has a certain set of beliefs. I'm part of an academic community and I have a certain set of beliefs that might be in contradistinction to other members of my same academic community. We have practices that are part of each individual culture to which we belong. I like to think of coming-of-age rituals in particular cultural groups. In Judaism, we have the bat mitzvah. In Hispanic cultures, there's the quinceañera. For Christians or for Catholics, it is the rite of communion and then confirmation. So there are so many multiple ways that cultures separate themselves from a larger world, although they also mingle within that larger world. So ethnography is about observing a cultural group, and it requires that we hone those observation skills. Now you'll see under the first bullet I talk about etic or emic observation. One is an etic or an emic observer. An etic observer is one who is outside the group, not a participant in the group. So those anthropologists who go down to the Amazon and study these lost tribes, they are etic observers. An emic observer is somebody who is within the group. So if I were to take a look at the culture of a university, well, I teach in a university, so I am a member of that culture and that community, so I'm an emic observer. And notice the things to which you pay attention: behavior, activity, and beliefs. But also, ethnography does not set itself apart from secondary resources. Ethnography and observation are primary research. Secondary research is when we go to the library, when we look up what others say about a particular group or what others say about a particular activity. I guess nowadays it's when we go to the web. And what ethnography does is use multiple methods. It's a mixed method kind of observation activity. Now, once upon a time, the ethnography was just a sort of scientific study. It was a white paper delivered at a conference by an anthropologist. Well, now ethnographies have become fictionalized in a lot of ways. There's a guy named John Van Manen who talks about tales, realist tales, that an ethnographer can't tell the story of an entire culture without looking at multiple people. The most recent example of this, I think, in the public eye was Rigoberta Menchú, who won the Nobel Prize for writing about her people. Oh God, I can't remember if it was Guatemala or a Central American country. I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, she wrote her narrative. She said it was about her story, but then people discovered, wait a second, all the things didn't happen to her. Some happened to her brother, some happened to a friend. And her argument was, I am my culture. I am inseparable from my culture. What happens to my culture happens to me. So we have a very Western way of thinking, or we have a very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant way of thinking. And one of the things that ethnography does is make us look at how other people think. And I think in the Unlikely Disciple, that's what Roos discovers. He has this very clear way of thinking that is juxtaposed against the way of thinking of the people who come to that university. Anyway, so the idea of writing an ethnography, regardless of whether it's fictional or if it's a scientific report, has the same essential steps, which is where, and you see them bulleted here, identifying a cultural group, developing a plan. Now, you guys for this class write a short ethnography. When I use it with my students, they write it over 8, 12, even 15 weeks, so they really need a plan. Then you've got to identify the scene and make contact, and somebody asked the question, or it was raised in class, you always ask if you are allowed to observe. You always explain what you are doing and tell them what the result will be. Because you'll see in the fourth bullet, we're talking about gathering data and doing primary and secondary observation. Excuse me. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, we're talking about doing primary and secondary observation. Some of that primary observation will be interviews. And you always have to tell somebody, introduce yourself, here's your interview, can I interview you, here's what I want to ask you, and be very, very careful as you take their words and try and translate them into your own. Then there's the analysis that I was talking about earlier. What am I learning about this group from these things, these various notes I've collected? And then we sit down and we write our little ethnographic project. Now, this slide is titled Reading an Ethnography, but I'd really like to call it Reading Ethnographically, if I don't even think that's a word. But I think we can look at various texts through the same lens we do the cultures that we examine. So I want us to think a little bit about that. For example, you're looking at Ruth talking about being an unlikely disciple at this university, right? Well, he's doing a kind of ethnography, and you can read his book through that ethnographic lens. I do it in literature classes a lot. I read a lot of 19th century British and American literature that really talks about the rise of industrialization. And realist novels of that period will take you into the lives. They want to show you the lives of the people who live in poverty in northern England or in New York City, in urban New York City, working in factories. And so they try to depict the lives of the people within a narrative. And, well, it could be a love story. Within this narrative, a famous one is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell in the 19th century. And she really takes us into the lives of the factory owners and the middle class and then the working poor. And we get to go inside and see what their places look like. And we get to see the rituals that they have. And we get to sort of understand their beliefs as they begin to think about forming a union. So if you look at this bulleted list, it's the same things that one does when they write an ethnography, but it's also a way of looking at the things we read. So who is the group being depicted? Are they industrial workers? Are they residents on the Mississippi in Huck Finn? Identifying the writer's intent. Every writer has a purpose for writing, something they want you to walk away with. So what does that writer want you to walk away with? How do they want you to think or act? Well, that's the result of study, right? In writing an ethnography, that's what you're doing. You're trying to examine a group and then say, what does this group believe? How do they think? How do they act? I want to share that with the person reading my ethnography. Then you pay attention to the minutiae, what we call thick description. Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist / ethnographer, coined this term thick description. I mean, really paying attention. And you want to look at how the writer distinguishes between the groups. Is it by education? Is it by economics? Is it by a belief system? Then you draw conclusions, the writer draws conclusions. And once you've done all that, either as an ethnographer or as a reader of a text through the lens of ethnography, what you wind up doing is having a valid and informed assessment or critique of the work. Not this, I like it, I don't like it. It's, I like it because he does this well. I don't like it because I don't believe he has captured the cultural scene. Stuff like that. Now, I keep talking about cultural scene, and here's your definition. It's a place where members of a cultural group share activities, where they go to some place and they participate in whatever their cultural group is going to do. And so here's a list of, we've got a Christian college in Bruce's book. I've had students study a Starbucks. We have anthropologists who do the Lost Tribe. And I've read a bunch of ethnographies about school playgrounds. Somebody will watch them, like third grade students out on a school playground being completely violent, and it's a creepy looking image. Or people have studied the mole people, and those are people who live in the subway system, like homeless people in New York. There's so, I mean, the groups are endless. I've seen truck stops studied, and it's any place. Wait, I'm going to pause a second because you might go, what about truck stops? This was a truck stop on an international, like I think in Iowa, and whatever that highway is that goes through the middle of the country. Anyway, and it's a travelers. In other words, it's people who travel. Johnson Corner's our local one. I mean, this is a place that has a culture of its own. So that's what you're trying to do. How do travelers behave? How do people on long journeys? How do truckers? You go to these truck stops, and they got showers and all kinds of things. So it becomes an opportunity to examine a world that hopefully your audience is less familiar with. Now, in terms of those literary cultural scenes, I think of Mark Twain's Mississippi, as Huck and Jim go down the Mississippi, and every time they land on shore, they meet a different group of people. You've got Coketown in Charles Dickens's novel Hard Times, and that's another of those industrial towns. You've got Tolkien's Middle Earth, and I haven't read a lot of those, so I can't really tell you much more about them. And if you watch True Blood, you've got Bontemps in that series. Yeah, Sookie lives in Bontemps, and they got all that vampire stuff going on. I can't figure out the whole vampire thing. But anyway, so you see that, but each of these places in novels could be looked at through the lens of ethnography. Now, for your purposes, you have to select a cultural scene to study, and sometimes that can be a challenge. You're like, I don't know where to go. Well, when I work with my students, I say to them, find something you don't know about. So are there people who have hobbies? Do you know that UNC has a fencing team? Who knew? I've always wanted to fence, so that might be an interesting place for me to study. Extracurricular activities. There's the ultimate frisbee thing. Are those people who walk around playing frisbee golf? Or are there sports? What is it that you would like to know more about that you find interesting? Or from what kind of experience or groups have you been sheltered because of your upbringing? Maybe you grew up without much struggle. And if that's the case, the idea of going to look at what happens at a soup kitchen. I volunteer I'm a cook at the Catholic Charities Mission up in Fort Collins. And that's a world very different from the one I know. If you have grown up in a Roman Catholic family, have you ever been to a temple and seen what rituals are involved in Jewish tradition? So this idea of finding something new to you that you could begin to learn about. Now, then there are the sort of there's a word for this, I can't think of the logistical issues. Can you get to the places you want to observe? You live in Greeley, you want to go to the mission in Fort Collins, you better be able to get there in a car because mass transit isn't going to do it. Are there people to interview? Because meeting the people and understanding what they think or what they believe, not that that guides exactly what you say, they might believe something and you see something completely different in it. But you want to be able to interview them. Here's a really interesting example. I had a student study crew, which is, I'm not 100% sure what it is, but it's the sort of a religious student fellowship that goes on over at the UC. And she was studying them. She was studying a bunch of girls who went to the crew, and I guess it's one night a week, Wednesday or Thursday, I can't, maybe Tuesday, I don't know. And she spent the day, she would go with them, and she would watch them as they would prepare, and they would always, they'd always pick out the right outfit, and they would travel as a bunch of girls, and they'd be giggling, and there'd be music, and yada yada. And she said in her analysis, it's not unlike what I and my girlfriends do when we're going out to ladies' night at a bar. And, it might sound like an awkward comparison, but she's saying that she and her friends are not part of a religious community, but they're part of this social community, and she goes to a bar not to drink and get picked up, but to hang out with her friends. So it wasn't that different. So if you were to talk to somebody in crew and make that comparison, they might be, what are you talking about? I'm not going to a bar, I'm going to a religious group. But her ability to observe, she interviewed and then came to her own conclusions. So it's not that you interview to get the answers, you get the interview to add to the mass of information you collect in order to draw your own conclusion. Anyway, you also have to think about how often, if you're going to multiple times to a site or if you're just going to go once. I've had people go to one of those like rock concerts or metal concerts or those, those big things that go around. I don't know, Follow the Dead, whatever it is. I mean the Grateful Dead, not the Walking Dead. And then, are there particular skills or knowledge that you need to know? Is there some context that you need to know? If I'm going to go to the fencing club, I might want to read up a little bit on fencing, just so I know what when people are talking, I need what to pay attention to, or I don't get stabbed by a pay or a foil. And if you think about reading ethnography or reading ethnographically, the idea is, how do you find a book that's going to be of interest to you? If somebody gives you free choice in reading, you ask yourself the same questions. Are there places or people that you're interested in? I have never been to Kathmandu, but I might want to read about it. I've never been to Alaska, so I might want to know what goes on up there. Are there experiences or groups that you've been sheltered from? Well, I haven't spent a lot of time with the Amish, and they fascinate me. So maybe I'd want to go read about the Amish. Are there authors who have written novels, or are there TV shows? Because, I'm talking about reading ethnography, and because I'm an English professor, of course, I focus on books. But think of television shows, right? Are there novels or shows available that give me a glimpse into worlds or experiences or groups? I'm watching this series, this BBC series, thanks to Netflix, which I'm bootlegging from somebody else. Anyway, I'm watching this series about a London hospital in 1906. And don't roll your eyes, because I know that sounds really boring to you. But that turn of the century is my area of expertise, both turn of the century in the United States and turn of the century in England. And so I'm like, oh my God, I found this thing, and how interesting, I can learn about it. And so one of the things that TV does is it takes us to other worlds, some of them real, some of them these really weird worlds that I don't want to be a part of. And then, do I need some background in order for me to understand what's going on? In this show, London Hospital, that I was talking about, every show opens up with some facts about medicine in the 1900s. I know nothing about medicine. I am scientifically challenged. So those medical facts help me contextualize what's going on in the story. If I didn't have them, I don't think I'd understand as well, and it would behoove me as a watcher of this to sort of get a picture of what London Hospital or what medicine was like at the turn of the century in London. So for example, it's the beginning of x-rays. So that kind of stuff. And this is where Wikipedia can be your friend. Let me repeat this in 2 words. Do not ever cite Wikipedia as a source. But Wikipedia is your friend, and going to read around a little background, then knowing how to dig more deeply into more legitimate sites. But to get that kind of context, just Google that Wikipedia thing. Now, one of the things you're going to do in your ethnography, as I keep repeating, is primary research, and those are taking notes. You go out and you take what are called field notes. And somebody asked a question, I think I answered it the same way, which is, yes, put the date, put the time, put the place, put what, make it as specific as possible to keep those records. Think about this. You're doing a small one. Think about people who spend years observing. If I'm going to, haul ass down to the Amazon to watch some unknown tribe, in their native splendor, I'm not going for 2 days. I'm going to hang out there for like 9 months, 12 months, 18 months. So I need to keep meticulous notes. And ethnography and anthropology began pre-technology, so it was all handwritten, and I'm still a fan of handwritten notes. So and so journals, for example, they talk about the double entry journal, and on the left side one keeps the facts of what one is seeing, and on the right side the responses to it or questions that emerge. So the left is pure facts and the right is your interaction with those facts. Then the idea of conducting interviews. Taking photographs and videos, you have that option. You always ask, may I take photographs? May I take video? May I use your name? Would you like me to use a different name? And then primary documents. If you go to observe a club, like we have the Ultimate Frisbee Club, that club has a charter. I happen to be the faculty advisor to the Ultimate Frisbee Club. So there's a charter and there's documents, and there are probably rules for Ultimate Frisbee. I have no idea. I just sign papers. So this idea of you're looking both at observing the people in the cultural scene, but then you're observing those primary resources, documents that they've created. I mean, if you're looking at the charter of a school or a church, any religious group, their policies, their mission statement. Also, brochures, handouts, things that they might give out at a meeting. All of those things are part of your field of study. And I say here, I don't have to read it to you, here's what your field notes should include. The details that you will need to be able to reference them. Being specific. The third bullet, though, I do want you to pay attention to, because this is the thing. observation, there's a wonderful essay called Look at Your Fish, or I can't remember. Damn. I'll get it to your instructors. And it's about this guy who in the 19th century wants to work with a scientist. And the guy's testing his powers of observation. So he gives them this fish, this dead fish, on a board. And he says to him, well, describe it. And the guy writes a description, fish 5 feet long, not 5 feet long, 5 inches long, whatever. And the guy who's hiring says, you're not showing me anything. Go describe it. And the point was, we have to really develop our observation skills. That's why I love ethnography. So pay attention and think about your senses. What do you see? And what do you see all around you? And what do you see, not just the big picture, but then hone in on little things. Move from this large and then scale down to small. What do you hear? What are the sounds? And listen, and first it might all be chatter, and then try to listen for those little side conversations. Really pay attention. Is there music? Is there, is there the hum of a motor? Is there some kind of ritual ringing of a bell? If you're watching fencing, the click-clack of the things, the foils, whatever. Texture is a hard thing to think about because we think about it as having to touch, but begin to look around you and look at the various textures. There might be something in that. If you are participating or you are observing a religious event, for example, there could be the plushness of the robes. There could be the sort of the graininess of communion wafers. I don't know, I'm stretching it here, but you see what I mean. It's part of being an observer. The sense of smell. And this is where churches come in. I'm Jewish. I did not attend church growing up, but I was a theology major, and I would go to church as an observer when I was at Georgetown, and these are the Jesuits. And that smell of incense, and every church smells the same, and it's a kind of incensey, I don't know what it is, but I walk into a church and it feels like I'm back in Washington, D.C. in 1977. And that, I'm always attentive to that. But being attentive to smells. We're in Greeley, for God's sake, okay? So we all know Wednesdays and Thursdays, man, you're just looking at your shoe to see what shit you stepped in. And then tastes. That's a hard one, too. I use an example, and this probably makes no sense to any of you, but if you've ever sat next to anybody who uses packets of Sweet and Low, which was the sweetener, the artificial sweetener of choice when I was your age, as soon as they open it, it's like the sugar, the sweetness gets into the air, and you taste it on your tongue. But also other kinds of if you participate in stuff, if you drink. My husband's Lutheran, so he goes to the Lutheran campus ministry up in Fort Collins, and I actually bake the communion bread sometimes. It's this little whole wheat thing with, honey and stuff. And I taste it. It makes me feel a little creepy because I'm not Catholic, so I always feel like I'm violating some rule. But I'll taste it to make sure it's sweet enough. But also, if you've ever looked at a communion wafer that melts, they offer wine, grape juice, and something else. I don't know. So this idea that there are tastes if you choose to participate. And so that was a long-winded thing. But the thing I also love about ethnography is that it is not scientific in that you are removed from it. We want your personal reactions. That's that right side of the double-entry journal. Pay attention to specifics. You want specifics. You want to talk about words you heard or phrases. You want to be able to summarize conversations. Begin to record questions you might have, especially if you plan to go back or you plan to conduct an interview. This way you can ask those questions about things you might not have understood. And pay attention to the rituals or artifacts. And I haven't talked a lot about those, but rituals, behaviors that you see, whether it's a reading of the minutes, whether it's a secret handshake, whether there's a song that people sing, whether it's a sports team and they do the same thing every time before a game. And artifacts are things specific. And let me go back to the church again, right? You've got all kinds of artifacts. You've got the censer, you've got the plate with the communion wafer, you have the various chalices. And it's really interesting at Lutheran Campus Ministry, one of the chalices is ceramic and one is metal. supposed to be gold, but I don't think it is. So you've got these various artifacts, and if you've ever watched at the end of while the people who have had communion are in moments of prayer, the priest or the pastor is putting away the artifacts that are used in communion, and there's a ritual to that. If you watch it, you should, because I'm not there for the religious significance of it. Everybody else has got their head down praying. I'm watching this go on. So pay attention to those kinds of artifacts, things they value. The sports teams that have a mascot, or my husband teaches at CU, and they've got their little buffalo there, who happens to be a girl. And one of his students used to be one of the buffalo wranglers. Well, that's an artifact. It has real significance. So I can't think of the buffalo's name at the moment. Anyway, you see where I'm getting. And as I say, you want to supplement what you learn or get clarification through interviews. And there are informal interviews where you're just walking around during an observation and asking questions, or there's formal interviews where you schedule a time to sit down and talk with somebody and ideally ask them questions for clarification. And as a writer, these are the kinds of activities that you are going to do. You're going to map the scene. And think about truly doing that. You can take all the pictures you want, obviously, and nowadays, if you get permission, but also sketching it out. Because sometimes when we sketch, we are really observant. Okay? And even if you start to sketch and go, oh, look at that, I need to look at what's going on and how that room is set up. I can sketch it, but I'm going to take a picture to remind myself. Attend to private language, that is the jargon that is used by a cultural group. And you know this, there are clubs you belong to, or activities you participate in. There could be video games that you play that have their own language that means nothing to anybody else. To people who don't attend Northern Colorado, if you go home and you say to your folks, hey, so I was hanging out at the UC, and then I went over to Holmes, and then I had to stop at Michener, they won't know what those are. They don't know that the UC is the university center, and they might not know that Holmes is a dining hall, that Michener is the library. So those kinds of things. And you might say to your grandma, well, I got my syllabus today, and she might not know what a syllabus is if she hasn't been in school in a long time. So this idea of each cultural group has its own set of rules, rituals, and language. Attend to body language in the cultural scene, how people act, if they feel comfortable, if they feel nervous. What are the scenes where people feel comfortable? If you've ever gone to, I had a student observe small claims court, and the people are very tense in small claims court. So they'd be sitting, really bundled up, really tight, wound like a spring. You go to watching kids in a playground versus in their classroom, they become like maniacs. So pay attention to body language. Read the artifact, right? I had a girl do cheerleaders at Windsor High, and her artifact was these little, I don't mean this to be improper, the little panties girls wear under their cheerleading skirts, and she brought them in and she talked about the history. She said, there's a history to these. My most favorite, I think, if one can have a most favorite, is a gal who worked, she was coming back to school, and she worked in a funeral home. And she brought in this tool that is used to shove up a corpse's nose, this is disgusting, to pull out veins. Oh my God, totally fascinating. And she was talking about that. So artifact analysis, and then ritual analysis. And NPR does a story, this is sort of an interesting one I heard recently, and this is completely prattling, but NPR did a story of the ritual of Jews have to be buried, when a Jew dies, a religious Jew dies, they have to be buried within 24 hours, because in the Jewish faith we do not embalm. But the body can never be alone. So this funeral parlor in New York hires people to stay with the bodies at night. And it was the story of this college student who needed to make money, so he would come to the funeral home, and you have to sit with the body. So he's in this mortuary or funeral home, I don't know if that's the difference, with all of these bodies of freshly dead Jewish folks, and he brings his dinner, and he opens his books, and it's this really odd, so you've got this sort of very religious ritual of the body, and this sort of guy who has no connection to it at all, eating a sandwich and studying his history book. Crazy stuff, right? Isn't it? Ethnography, very cool. And as I say, as a writer, you want to, I'm sorry, as a reader of text through my ethnographic lens, you want to pay attention to the same thing. What is the scene of this work? Is there dialect? What's unique? If you've ever read Huck Finn, you know there's dialect. If you've ever read Zora Neale Hurston, you know there's dialect. If you've ever read immigrant fiction from the first part of the 20th century, you know there's dialect. And so how does that affect our understanding or our interaction as a reader with the people about whom we're reading? Then ask yourself, you can't see body language, but a writer should be describing that. So how people move? Do they move elegantly and gracefully? Are they tensed up? And what does that tell us about the character? What things does the writer choose to focus on? I mentioned Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. She has another book named Mary Barton. And in fact, and one scene in that book, she goes down the stairs into this hovel that this working class family lives in. And she gives you the most minute description about everything in the room. And some people call it the best portrayal of the lives of the poor of Northern England during the Industrial Revolution that's ever been presented. That she just captures it, even though it's fictional. She creates this world that is so alive, and every broken china teacup, every lump of coal, every threadbare blanket is brought to life. Phenomenal. And then what rituals there are. And so and even in that scene, she describes a daughter making tea and using tea bags and finding this stale piece of bread and trying to bring it out. So there is this sort of family meal. And so we see that even in the horrors of poverty and misery, that they're trying to maintain this ritual of the family meal, something like that. So you see how you can read through the same lens, and it brings you a more intimate relationship with the text because you're so focused on what you're seeing on the page. So as a result of all of these various small parts that you're looking at, as a result of these artifact analysis and sight and body and interviews and yada yada, you collect them all together. And it's like writing any paper. Based on all of that, you try to interpret this data and you try to arrive at a conclusion. And one of the things that I haven't talked about but you really need to do is begin to ask yourself questions. Who are these people? What brings them together? Why do they come together? Those are the big questions that people want to know. How does this culture I found in the Amazon manage to endure in a world where they're living in prehistoric times? How are they facing the encroachment of civilization? You want those questions. You want this material to inspire you to want to share some information with your reader. And this is where your interaction with that experience is so key. And finally, what I ask for in my students are these 5 separate sections. However, in your work, you can combine these all into 1, 2, or 3 page paper, which is this clear set of steps. You need to identify the scene and give us a sense of what you're doing. You need to tell us how you collected your data. You need to give us this description. Take all of what you've looked at and create a single description. You give us the conclusion, your insights about the group, how it fits within the larger culture. How does Ultimate Frisbee fit within the university? Something like that. And then reflect on the experience. Reflect on how it changed you, your sense of the culture, your sense of yourself. It's the personal part, because that's what we're here to do, is learn. And ethnography is a chance to learn. So that's why that reflection piece is so significant. And that's it. That's everything I said. I did it shorter here, I think, than I did in the class, but I had fewer stories. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to answer them. Until then, have fun on your ethnography, your reading of text ethnographically, and your writing of your own ethnographic texts.